Hi, everyone. Sorry, So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Lynn Hagger. I'm a Patient Engagement Director at AstraZeneca and have been in industry for about 20 years now. And this is actually, just over the past couple of years, really refreshing to see how we're inputting into our clinical trials with regards to the patient. So, like I said, in the past couple of years, we've really been trying to create a framework within AstraZeneca as well as across industry, working with PFMD and other companies to really get a definition of patient centricity, but also to really input into our clinical studies. And we know the entire cycle of clinical, that we go through with a clinical study is important. But today I'm just going to focus on the first part, which is basically study planning and how we've been inputting patient insight into that particular aspect. Obviously, the goals of optimizing a clinical trial are, really meeting protocol improvement with no amendment post-approval. We obviously want to increase recruitment and retention of within those studies and protocol compliance as well. So when we were initially kind of embarking on deciding the framework for some clinical study or clinical trial optimizations, there was a number of ways of doing it, and there was no real set standard. We had the notion that you probably had to go on site to do an optimal clinical trial optimization. And so we embarked on an on-site study simulation here in the United States. It was kind of the first of its kind, looking at 18 patients across 2 different sites. We had one in Pennsylvania, one in Georgia, where we did a full simulation, literally. We put the patients through the rigors. They did a mock informed consent procedure, mock PROs, mock screening visit, mock dosing visit, the whole deal. And we debriefed patients and staff following the 2 simulations. And we found a number of things. We actually made some 21 different changes to our protocols following this. But they were pretty simple things, providing simple background materials in lay languages. Patients wanted a knowledgeable staff who were educated about the study, who weren't flailing through booklets and everything. They really wanted them to be trained and trusted when they went in about the study. They wanted their personal results following the study, and that's something that actually fueled a whole clinical trial transformation initiative within our organization, where we have a website now where patients can go on and actually look at their results following the study, and patients inputted into that as well. So patients wanted a comfortable setting. They wanted us to value their time and their flexibility within their schedule. Transportation, childcare needs if necessary, very simple, basic needs. And finally, confidentiality of patient data. It was, over there on additional issues, but to a patient, it's the primary issue. So using these results, as I mentioned, we made a number of different changes, and we actually increased recruitment and retention within those 2 clinical studies, and this was back in 2016. And it actually saved us an estimated of about $1.1 million had we not implemented these changes. So it really was significant. Problem was, looking back at some of the challenges of this actual study simulation had its own challenges. So it was really costly to do something like this, not to mention a lot of effort involved for all involved, patients, staff, AstraZeneca employees. It really was time consuming for having to bring patients in, having to take staff time from the sites, et cetera. And, we only had a couple of patients because this is so costly and involved, and effortful, that we only had 18 patients, and you can't really utilize tons of patients to do these types of simulations. So how do you go about getting the information without going on site? So we started looking into this after the fact and saying, these recommendations are fairly simple. Is there a way that we can actually elicit this type of information from patients looking at doing surveys or doing interviews, et cetera? So we looked at a couple of different methods using patient communities, online patient communities, and you're going to be hearing from patients like me in about 5 minutes. And so we utilized them for a nasal polyposis study. We've actually utilized them for probably 10 to 15 other studies since then. We also have, like I mentioned earlier while we were in discussion, about a patient partnership program, and these using patients as advisors. These are patient partners within a particular therapeutic area. They are knowledgeable in their disease, and they help us inform us on a regular basis with regards to our clinical studies. So as you can see, using both an online community as well as patient advisors, we found really similar results to what we actually got within our on-site simulations for a fraction of the cost, fraction of the effort, and fraction of the time. We found patients wanted these simple types of things to be provided to them and acknowledged before being able to get into a clinical study. So when we're looking at, we've done tens and tens of different study simulations now, and within that clinical trial framework, doing a study simulation or a protocol optimization, which we call it, is actually a standard now for us for every single protocol that we put through. And I encourage actually teams to come and make sure that we do that at the study design phase, where we'll actually have patients sitting there at the table with us and helping us design the study from the get-go. But what we see are basically the same sentiments that are coming back time and time again. And we can kind of generally class these into 4 different buckets. We have empowerment through information. So patients really want to be informed. They want the information to be lay and understandable. They want it to be meaningful and relevant to their lives. They want to understand not only the study, but how that affects their disease status, treatment management, and also social empowerment. Is there a way of getting and talking to other patients who have gone through similar things? Treating them as individuals, and this kind of falls in individuals and quality of care down in the 2 corners, where patients want physical and emotional comforts. They want transportation, childcare, us to be responsive to their needs, having a physician to talk to or a study coordinator. And then finally, leaving the study, they want follow-up and aftercare. They want transparency of their outcomes, and they want progress throughout the study. So, taking this into account, I think we've learned a lot through all the study simulations that we've done, but in this context today, it's really important for us to look at, this is a given almost, and now having done this a number of times, this is where we should start. We should do this with every single clinical study. And then from there, we get to ask the more important questions, about methodology, about benefit risks, and bringing in that more educated or type of patient, not necessarily a full patient scientist, but somebody who is knowledgeable about being able to input into the study, the nitty-gritty themselves. So we take care of this, and I think we get a lot more value out of our protocol optimizations later on. And I'm blinking, so I'm going to stop there.
Are you done? Okay, great.
Done, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Oh, Lynn, stay up there. Lynn, please. You'll have a few questions, I suspect. Did you have a question, Nick, or is that just left over from last time? All right. So go ahead, Kevin, and you as well. Thanks, Suzanne.
So, Lynn, I am always a very skeptical person about these presentations for pharma, but that was actually good.
Well, if ever there was a left-handed compliment.
I mean, and what I mean by that is that you were acknowledging that this is like a baseline, and it was respectful. So,
yeah, well,
nice,
thank you.
Nice job.
I mean, it is a
All
baseline,
right.
and you can't get past this. I mean, I think it's something that we should, as a standard, human factors are things, and I hate to say it, but I read protocols all the time that come back. 90% of the time, a lot of these are not taken into account. So we're really trying to implement that to get this right to start with. Don't come to me until you get this right.
Excellent. Well done.
Mm-hmm.
Suzanne, and then Nina, and TJ, and back to Philip, and back to Max. You've got a lot of follow-up questions on this one.
Okay.
My gosh.
I'll be
Suzanne.
quick then. This is Suze with the Arthritis Foundation. I wanted to dig a little deeper into sort of how you do this. One of the things at the foundation that we sort of offer up if we recruit patients to do something like this, I help facilitate or someone else helps facilitate, because what we've seen is sometimes there's a fear if it's a person who maybe, and I'm not saying this is the case, so this is a question, I'll eventually get to the question. So if the person sort of on the other side hasn't done a lot of this work, there's almost like a shield. And if a patient says something that the facilitator doesn't understand, it's almost like there's a fear they'll be offensive or they don't want to pry. And so they just sort of stop and say, oh, thank you for that input, and kind of write it down. And I can tell you have no idea what they just said. You have no idea what they mean. And so we're trying to break through that with some training that we're doing to kind of, it's not meaningful if you don't dig and if you don't keep asking questions. What does it look like for you and your company? Are the facilitators from a patient advocacy org? Are they internal? Are they trained? Can you talk a little bit more about what that interaction looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're absolutely bang on, because originally we were doing this via survey, particularly, and utilizing an online community is a great way of doing that. But sometimes you can't probe, and patients on the other end don't actually understand the question either, and they're sort of like, why are you asking me about doing a body box for an asthma study? I don't even know what that is, so they just kind of ignore the question, and you don't get the responses you want. But we actually have our internal teams, our medical affairs leads, do the interviewing normally. So we send out a protocol or a study design concept. I like to get it early before we go into protocol phase, and we make sure that it is put into lay language, first of all. So we actually explain, any procedure is explained in full detail, and then we have somebody who is actually writing the study or involved in the full study asking the questions. So they can not only get to the details, they actually know the information of why we're doing this particular procedure, or why you have to keep coming back 3 times in 1 week, or stay for 15 hours to do, spirometry or whatever,
Great. So we have TJ, Nina, and Philip. TJ, please.
TJ Sharp. There you go. TJ Sharp, patient advisor to the Transcelerate patient experience workstream. With these different buckets, do you find that different patient groups or different disease states or different types of diseases weigh one or more of those factors more heavily than the other?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we do this, we have patient groups right now in our oncology area, in respiratory, in cardiovascular, in diabetes, and in our autoimmune area. So we see different things coming up in different disease areas. And I mean, obviously, it's going to take into account cultural differences, country differences, local guidelines, GCP guidelines. You can't do all these things in every single study. But this is kind of a good sort of smattering of saying, let's make sure that we're taking most of these into account when we're writing our study design, such that if it does come up later on, we know to address it. And if we can address it at a local or country level, great. And if it does meet guidelines, even better. I mean, some things like childcare and paying for somebody's taxi, you can't do that in some countries and stuff like that. So it really does depend, but it's absolutely dependent on therapeutic area primarily as well.
Excellent. Nina? Oop, and then we'll go to her. So Nina first, and we've got Philip, we've got Barbara, and we've got John in the back. James in the back. Thank you, James.
Okay.
Nina, you're up.
Hi, Nina Alawalia from Genentech. Thanks so much for a great presentation. I wanted to ask, I think for the lupus study, you referred to an estimated cost savings, and of course that's $1 million question for those of us that are trying to push more patient research at this stage at protocol development, and we have teams that are really receptive to it and others that say, what am I going to get out of this? So how did you go about estimating that cost savings?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I wasn't involved in the whole cost savings thing, and it actually struck me as well when I first saw that presentation. The way they did it was they actually had a control group of patients that they surveyed, and what was your likeliness of enrolling in this study, of staying in the study, how often would you undergo the procedures, et cetera, and then looking at, if we change these things, what would that look like? And it actually meant X number of patients being within the study, or enrollment faster, retaining more patients in less dropouts, patients being more compliant, less glitches with data analysis in the end. So it was putting dollar amounts on all of that, and I don't know exactly how the ROI was done, but it was literally dollar amounts on what's the cost of losing a patient halfway through the study. How much did you pay the site for enrolling that patient? How much? All those kinds of things. Yeah. But we did do the analysis based on a small survey as well. But I mean, to think that you could save $1 million just by asking some of these simple questions is pretty impressive.
It is. So these are great questions and follow-ups, but always be thinking about, as you get now into the next sections, how's that going to turn into a research program and agenda, right? And how are we going to scale this up? So Philip, Barbara, and James, and we'll have to move on to the next speaker.
Okay, so
Philip?
just a quick comment in response to Suzanne's question. So a strategy that's really been useful in kind of my public health experience and community partnered experience is actually train kind of folks from the patient community to co-facilitate with your qualitatively trained research staff. Might be a way to build that kind of relationship. My question is thinking about what is AstraZeneca's approach to ensuring kind of socio-demographic diversity in the folks that you're working with kind of early on to design these protocols, et cetera? And how successful has that strategy been?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of our patient partnership program, we actually have patients from different countries and different socioeconomic regions, as well as education levels and different expertise. So we have patients that are actually scientists. We have patients that are actually physicians. We have patients who are from a minority group, from different areas of the world. So it's really a smattering to make sure that we're getting that kind of overview within the group. I also suggest that is really more of a qualitative thing when you're starting. You kind of we have these small groups of like 20 patients, 30 patients that we start with. You're getting sort of that quality interview where you can literally speak to them and get the nitty-gritty. Then it's a matter of going out and doing a full survey. If you really have some issues with the study, we would put out even a bigger survey to make sure that we're hitting those demographics. And in the lupus study, it was actually a big deal because lupus hits mostly African American women. And they initially went to Altoona, Pennsylvania, and had a bunch of white women and one man. And so it was a big deal because it was like, well, why did you go and do this when your actual demographic for disease is an African American women living in the South? Okay, so we had to go and get a second site. And we actually found similar results, which is great, but there were some things, like trust in the physician was big in the South with the African American community, whereas in Pennsylvania, they were here nor there. So we did find things like that within the two demographic groups, but it's important to think about your end user, of course. Why are we doing this was the big question, right? Who are we doing it for? So, yeah.
So these are lightning presentations. We'll try to make these now lightning questions and answers. No, Barbara, you're still up. We're going to go through, right? But let's try to keep things crisp.
I'm going to be very brief because I'm going to make something that's a little bit more of a recommendation. It just strikes me through the day, and in particular with this topic, that what we're talking about in terms of research and operational processes spans the gamut from sociological, public health, epidemiological, economics. Of course, I was picking up on the ROI comments, and science, and true hard science. And we need to publish this work. So I believe that getting it down to a series of things that you did with an outcome that's measurable, especially that has an economic benefit, that needs to go into the public domain because that's the place where people are really going to glom on and they'll start replicating it. So I just was going to encourage you to make sure you publish it.
It was published actually last year.
Great.
So it's actually in the book.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You're
Great.
welcome.
And to our dissemination point, we've been coming to several times. So James in the back.
Yes, James Valentine from Hyman Phelps and McNamara. You've already partially answered my question. It related to the number of individuals that you would work with, both patient partners, but then online the online patient communities. And so you said it was about 20 to 30 patient advisors that you had a qualitative interview process with. I was curious, what's the size of, when you go out and survey the online patient community, how many patients, per protocol are you surveying? And do you ever have an iterative process for either your engagement with the patient partners and the qualitative interviews or the surveying where you might drill down on particular issues, since you don't necessarily have the same opportunity online to have that, kind of digging and following up?
Yeah, absolutely. Very good question. So yes, we do have about 20 to 30 in our partnership groups. When we go online, it actually depends which group you're using and which disease area you're going into. So, for instance, I'm putting something together right now for eosinophilic diseases, or, eosinophilic-driven diseases. There's not a lot out there in Churg-Strauss. There's not a lot out there in eosinophilic, esophagitis. there's literally 3 or 4 patients online. Whereas you go into asthma and diabetes, you've got 20, 30,000 patients online. So we can really pull from the larger populations, and I'm sure, I know you're going to be probably giving a presentation on PLM soon about how we do that, because we do that with you guys a lot. But we utilize groups outside the U.S. as well, like Inspire and Health Unlocked and Serenity, that have large patient populations too. So it's nice to go to a couple hundred at least for a survey if you're going to do something. We also ask those 20 or 30 patients that are within our partners program. They are experts here, so we do ask them to look at it qualitatively. Then we ask them to help us write the survey. So we utilize them for the next step, for the quantitative part of it.
Matt, you're up.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I agree with you that there is sufficient material to have a sort of a common standard on these issues. And I think that industry is particularly well equipped to do that, because you have all these multiple sites across the different countries. And you can measure the effect, as you say, by economic evaluation and recruitment and all this kind of stuff. My question is, since you're mentioning empowerment, out of curiosity, one could also think about measuring these in terms of to what extent it empowers patients. So, do you have an instrument for measuring empowerment in association with this?
We use the patient activation measure, so the PAM scale is what we typically use. It's not necessarily empowerment per se, but more how activated and engaged a patient is with their disease. I don't know that the two are the same thing, but I think the more engaged and activated a person gets, the more empowered they probably feel. So don't quote me on that, but not scientifically proven here, but I think that's what we utilize now.
But there are some instruments, so it could be something that we could discuss, yeah.
Yep, sure.
John, did you have something quick you signaled?
Shortest question possible. For the cost savings, as a follow-up to Nina's question, did you subtract out the cost of the simulation?
Yes, yeah. So it was about a $1.1 million savings. The simulation actually cost about $100,000 to do, which is completely not scalable. If you're looking at the amount of studies that a typical industry goes through, or pharmaceutical company goes through, you just can't do that. So it literally was a tenth of the savings. That's why we use other methods.
Very good. So the lightning presentation that sparked the most questions out of all this, if not a wildfire. Well done, Lynn. And great questions. Great